You really think anyone's coming for you?" The words hung in the air like they had weight, like they'd been said 100 times before and never proven wrong. And the night around Marcus Reed felt still in a way that didn't match what was happening in front of him. Orange light flickering across the pavement, reflecting in the windows of nearby homes, stretching shadows that made everything feel larger than it was, louder than it should have been. And yet Marcus didn't move, not an inch. Not even when the heat pressed against his skin, like a warning. Not even when the laughter behind him grew sharper, more confident, like they had already decided how this story ended. Because to them it was simple, a man standing alone, out of place, outnumbered, and clearly, in their minds, out of options. But Marcus wasn't looking at them. Not really. His eyes stayed fixed on the car, on the way the light bent across its surface, on the quiet detail most people would miss. How nothing about him reacted the way they expected. No panic, no raised voice, no desperate reach for help. Just stillness, the kind that doesn't come from fear, but from knowing something no one else in the moment understands. And that's what made one of them step closer, just a little too close, close enough to test the silence, to see if it would break, say something. The man said, his tone half challenge, half amusement, like he needed Marcus to confirm the role he'd already assigned him. But Marcus didn't answer right away. He just turned his head. Slightly, slow, deliberate. The kind of movement that makes people notice even when they don't want to. And when he finally spoke, his voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It landed flat and controlled. "You're making a mistake." And for a second, just a second, something shifted, not in the crowd, not in the voices, but in the space between them, like the air itself paused, waiting to see if anyone would catch it, but they didn't. Because confidence built on assumption doesn't hear warnings, it laughs at them. And that's exactly what happened. Louder now, bolder, someone muttering under their breath, "Yeah, sure we are." And another voice cutting in, "Go ahead, call someone, see what happens." And that was the moment they thought they had him. The moment where in every version of this story they'd seen before, the person standing where Marcus stood would reach into their pocket, fumble for a phone, search for backup that never came fast enough. But Marcus didn't move, not toward his pocket, not toward them, nowhere. His hands stayed at his sides, relaxed. Like this wasn't a situation that required urgency, like time wasn't something he was running out of. And that was the detail no one there could explain. The calm that didn't match the circumstances, the quiet that didn't fit the script. And across the street, someone noticed, a woman standing on her porch, phone in hand, not recording yet, just watching, trying to understand why the only person who should have been reacting wasn't, why the one being tested looked like the only one who already knew how this would end. And Marcus, still facing forward, finally added one more sentence, just enough to settle into the moment, just enough to leave something behind. "You should have walked away 5 minutes ago." And this time, the laughter came slower, not gone, not even close, but different, like it had to push through something it didn't expect to be there. And somewhere in the distance, faint enough to ignore, but real enough to exist, a single car door closed, soft, precise, and completely out of place in a night that was about to change everything. The laughter did not disappear, but it lost its rhythm, like something unseen had stepped into the space and quietly rearranged the rules. And Marcus felt it before anyone else did, not because he was looking for it, but because he had learned years ago how to recognize the exact moment when control shifts, when noise stops being power and starts becoming cover. And he kept his posture the same, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, as if none of it required adjustment, while the man closest to him shifted his weight, just slightly, the kind of movement that says confidence is starting to ask questions. "You keep talking like something is about to happen," he said, forcing a smirk that did not quite land the same way anymore. "But I do not see anything." And Marcus finally turned fully now, not fast, not aggressive, just enough to meet his eyes. And there was something in that look that did not match the situation, not fear, not anger, something colder, something already decided. "That is because you are looking for the wrong signal," Marcus said, and the sentence did not sound like a threat. It sounded like information, like a fact that did not need to be argued. And across the street the woman on the porch lifted her phone a little higher, her thumb hovering over the screen, unsure if she was about to record something ordinary or something she would not be able to explain later. And the group behind Marcus tried to recover the tone they had before, one of them stepping forward again, louder this time. "Man, you think this is a movie or something?" he said, gesturing around like the whole scene was proof that nothing was changing. But even he glanced over his shoulder for half a second, just enough to check what he had not needed to check before, and that was when it became noticeable, not loud, not dramatic, just different. The street that had felt open now felt watched, the quiet carrying weight, the kind that presses on conversations until they slow down whether people want them to or not. And Marcus noticed the smallest detail, the one most people would miss. The way one of the parked cars down the block had not been there 10 minutes ago, the way its engine was no longer running, but its presence felt intentional, placed, and he did not react, because reacting would mean explaining, and nothing about this moment needed explanation yet. And then it happened again, subtle but undeniable, another car door closing somewhere out of sight, not rushed, not careless, precise, and the man in front of Marcus heard it this time, his head turning instinctively before he caught himself and forced his attention back. "You got people coming?" he asked, trying to sound amused, but the question slipped out before he could stop it, and Marcus almost smiled. Not enough for anyone to call it that, just a shift in expression that suggested the answer had been there the entire time. "I told you," Marcus said quietly. "You should have walked away." And now the silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like something was already in motion beyond what anyone here could see. And the woman across the street pressed record without realizing it, her voice barely above a whisper. Something is happening. And she was right, because down the road, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, a black vehicle turned the corner slowly, not speeding, not hesitating, moving with the kind of certainty that does not ask for permission, and Marcus did not look at it. Not yet, because the real moment was not its arrival. It was the realization spreading across the faces in front of him, the slow, reluctant understanding that whatever they thought this was, it was no longer under their control. The black vehicle did not rush, and it did not hesitate. It moved at a steady pace like it had already calculated the exact second it needed to arrive, and that alone made the street feel smaller, tighter, like the space everyone had been standing in was no longer neutral ground, but something claimed, something observed, and Marcus finally shifted his gaze toward it, not with urgency, but with recognition, the kind that comes from expectation fulfilled rather than surprise, and the man in front of him noticed that change immediately. "Who is that?" he asked, the edge in his voice no longer hidden, and for the first time since this started, no one answered right away, not Marcus, not anyone behind him, because the answer was not something they were ready to hear, and the vehicle rolled closer, slowing just enough that its presence stretched out the moment, every second feeling deliberate. And across the street the woman recording stepped off the curb without realizing it, her attention locked on what was unfolding, her voice barely steady as she whispered into her phone. "This is not normal." And she was right, because nothing about the timing felt accidental anymore. Not the quiet, not the shifting tension, not the way the men who had been laughing minutes ago now stood with their shoulders tighter, their eyes moving more than before, scanning instead of dominating. And Marcus let the silence build, let it do the work he did not need to do himself, because he had seen this pattern before, not here, not exactly like this, but close enough to recognize the outcome long before it arrived. And it pulled something from memory, something older, a moment years ago when he was standing outside a building he had every right to enter, being told with polite certainty that he did not belong, that his name did not carry weight in that space. And he remembered how his father had not raised his voice then either, how he had simply made a call, waited, and let the truth walk in on its own. And now here it was again, different place, same lesson, and Marcus exhaled slowly, not from stress but from completion, like a countdown reaching its final number, and the vehicle came to a stop just a few feet away, the engine going silent with a precision that made it feel intentional, and no one moved at first, not even the man who had been the loudest earlier, because something about the stillness demanded it, like interrupting would only make things worse. And then the door opened, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to break the line between anticipation and reality, and a figure stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a way that did not try to impress but did not need to. And the reaction was immediate but quiet, one of the men taking half a step back before he caught himself. another lowering his voice without realizing it, and Marcus did not step forward, did not wave, did not call out, because this was not a reunion. It was a confirmation, and the man who had asked who it was earlier swallowed once, his confidence recalculating in real time. "You know him?" he asked, softer now, and Marcus looked at him for a moment, long enough for the answer to settle before he said it. "No," he replied, his tone steady, controlled. "He knows me." And that was when the shift became undeniable, not loud, not explosive, but absolute, like the entire scene had been flipped without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. And from the corner of the street, another car slowed, then another, not crowding, not chaotic, just present, like pieces moving into place. And the man who had been smiling earlier now looked at the vehicle, then back at Marcus, and for the first time, he did not have anything to say. The man who stepped out of the vehicle did not raise his voice, and he did not rush his steps. Yet every movement carried the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. And the air shifted again, not with noise but with recognition, the kind that travels faster than words. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, because this moment was never about reaction. It was about confirmation, and the man walked forward with measured precision, his shoes quiet against the pavement, his gaze moving once across the scene before settling on Marcus. And for a brief second nothing else existed, not the people watching, not the tension hanging in the street, just that single line of sight. And then he gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to acknowledge what had already been understood, and the men who had been standing closest felt it immediately. The shift from control to uncertainty, one of them clearing his throat as if sound alone could restore what had been lost. "Look, whatever this is," he started, his voice attempting confidence but landing somewhere weaker. "It is not that serious." And the words sounded thinner than they had minutes ago, like they no longer held the same weight in the space. And the man who had arrived did not respond to him. Not yet, his attention still on Marcus as if everything else was secondary. And Marcus finally spoke, his tone calm, almost conversational. "You took your time." And the man's reply came just as evenly. "I arrived exactly when I needed to." And that exchange, simple as it was, landed harder than anything that had been said before, because it revealed something the others were just beginning to understand. This was not coincidence. This was timing, deliberate and controlled. And across the street the woman recording lowered her voice even more, her words barely audible as she said, "They know each other." And it was not a question anymore. It was a realization, and one of the men shifted again, this time more visibly, his eyes moving between Marcus and the man who had arrived, trying to piece together something that made sense. "Who are you?" he asked, the question directed outward but rooted in doubt, and the man did not answer right away. He simply turned his head slightly, taking in the group with a calm that felt heavier than anger, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and impossible to ignore. "That depends," he said, pausing just long enough for the silence to settle. "Again, on what you think you just did." And no one responded, because for the first time the question was not rhetorical. It demanded reflection, something none of them had prepared for, and Marcus watched it unfold without interruption, because this was the moment where understanding begins, not from explanation but from realization. And in the distance another vehicle came to a stop, then another, not crowding, not chaotic, just present, reinforcing what was already clear. This situation was no longer contained to a single moment. It had expanded, quietly, completely, and the man who had been the loudest earlier took a step back, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to signal what his voice no longer could, and he tried again, softer now. "We did not know," he said, and the response came immediately, not louder, not sharper, just final. "That is the problem." And the words settled into the space like something permanent, something that could not be taken back or reinterpreted. And Marcus finally shifted his stance, just slightly, enough to show that the moment had reached its next phase, and the man beside him glanced once more at the group, then back to Marcus, and without raising his voice or changing his tone, he said the name that changed everything: Marcus Reed. And this time it was not introduction, it was identification, the kind that carries history, weight, and consequence all at once. and the street that had once felt loud now felt silent in a way that made every breath noticeable, because now they understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to know they had misjudged something far bigger than they had ever considered. The name did not echo, but it did not need to. It settled into the space with a quiet finality that made everything else feel secondary, and Marcus did not react to hearing it because it was not new to him. But to everyone else it landed like a key turning in a lock they did not know existed, and the man standing beside him shifted his attention fully to the group now, his posture unchanged yet somehow heavier, like the moment itself had taken on structure, and the men who had been speaking freely minutes ago found themselves searching for words that no longer came as easily. One of them glancing toward the street as if looking for an exit that had not been there before. "Look," he said again, trying to rebuild something from what was already gone. "This got out of hand. That is all." And the explanation sounded smaller than the situation, like it belonged to a different version of events. And Marcus let the silence stretch before responding, not rushing, not correcting, just allowing the weight of what had already happened to sit where it was. "Out of hand means you lost control," he said calmly. This was never about control, and the distinction hung there, subtle but sharp, and the man beside him finally took a step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to shift the center of the moment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of clarity that did not invite interruption. "You made a decision," he said, looking at each of them in turn, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating what was already evident. And now you are standing inside the result of it. And no one argued, because the framing removed the distance they had been trying to create. It did not allow for misunderstanding or excuse. And across the street the woman recording exhaled slowly, her voice steadying as she continued. "He is not raising his voice," she whispered, almost to herself. "But they are listening." And that was the shift no one could ignore anymore. The volume of the situation had dropped, but its intensity had risen. And another car door closed somewhere behind the first vehicle, followed by quiet footsteps that did not rush to join, but made their presence known, and the group noticed, their attention pulling in multiple directions now, no longer fixed, no longer confident. And one of them spoke again, softer this time. "We did not know who he was." And this time Marcus did not answer, because the response did not belong to him. It came from the man beside him, immediate and precise. "You knew exactly who you thought he was," he said, and the correction landed deeper than any accusation, because it did not challenge their knowledge, it exposed their assumption, and for a moment no one moved. Not Marcus, not the group, not even the woman recording across the street, because the truth had already shifted the ground beneath them, and Marcus felt the memory surface again, not as pain but as confirmation, the pattern repeating itself in a different setting. The same misplaced certainty, the same quiet correction. And he understood now why his father had always said that moments like this were not about proving anything. They were about revealing what was already there. And he looked at the man beside him. Just once. A brief exchange that carried years of unspoken understanding. And then back to the group, who now stood without direction, their earlier energy replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. And one of them finally asked the question they had been avoiding, his voice low, almost cautious. "So what happens now?" And the answer did not come immediately, because it did not need to. The moment itself was already unfolding in a way they could not control, and when it did come, it was not loud, not dramatic, just steady, deliberate, and final. "Now," the man said, his gaze unwavering. "You listen." No one spoke right away. Not because they did not have something to say, but because they understood for the first time that saying the wrong thing would make everything worse. And Marcus could see it clearly now, the shift from noise to caution, from assumption to hesitation. And it did not come from fear alone. It came from awareness, the slow realization that they were no longer defining the moment. They were inside it, reacting to something already set in motion, and the man beside him let the silence do its work before continuing. His voice steady, measured, never rising above what was necessary. "You had time," he said, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating what had already passed. Time to think, time to stop, time to step back. And each word landed with intention, like markers placed along a path they had chosen not to see. and one of the men shifted his stance again, his arms no longer folded, his posture no longer firm. "We did not think it would go this far," he said, the sentence sounding incomplete even as he spoke it, because it did not answer the question that now existed in the space, and Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "That is the problem with assumptions," he replied. "They only work until reality shows up." And across the street the woman recording nodded to herself without realizing it, her voice barely above a whisper as she continued. "They are listening now." And she was right. Every movement, every glance, every breath in the space had slowed down, like time itself had adjusted to match the weight of what was unfolding. And the man beside Marcus took another step forward, not closing the distance but redefining it, making it clear that proximity no longer belonged to them. And when he spoke again, it was not louder, it was clearer. "You said you did not know," he continued, his gaze moving from one face to another. "But not knowing does not remove responsibility." And no one interrupted, because the words did not leave room for it. And Marcus felt the memory surface again, sharper this time, standing years ago beside his father as he watched someone try to explain away a decision with the same language, the same tone, the same quiet attempt to shrink something that could not be reduced. And he remembered what his father had told him afterward, that moments like this are not about what people say when they are confident. They are about what they say when that confidence is gone. And now he was watching it happen in real time, the unraveling not loud, not dramatic, but complete. And one of the men finally exhaled, long and slow, as if he had been holding something in since the moment began. "So what do you want from us?" he asked, the question no longer defensive, no longer challenging, just uncertain. And Marcus did not answer immediately, because the answer did not belong to urgency. It belonged to clarity, and the man beside him spoke instead, his tone unchanged. "This is not about what we want," he said, pausing just long enough for the meaning to settle. "It is about what you chose." And that distinction settled into the space with finality, removing any remaining illusion that this could be negotiated or redirected. And in the distance, another presence became noticeable, not loud, not intrusive, just there, reinforcing what had already been established, that this moment had expanded beyond a single interaction, beyond a single mistake. And Marcus finally stepped forward, just once, not to confront, not to escalate, but to stand where the moment required him to be, his voice calm, steady, and unmistakably certain. "You had a chance to define this differently," he said, looking directly at the man who had spoken the most earlier, "but you chose not to." And the words did not rise, they did not need to, because the weight behind them carried everything they required, and the man did not respond, not because he could not, but because for the first time since this began, he understood that there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been set into motion. The silence did not break, but it deepened, like the space itself had decided to hold its breath, and Marcus stood there with the same calm presence that had unsettled them from the beginning. Except now it carried something heavier, something undeniable, because the moment had crossed a line that could not be walked back, and the men in front of him felt it, even if they could not fully explain it, the way their words had stopped working, the way their posture no longer matched their earlier confidence. And the man who had asked what would happen next lowered his gaze for just a second, as if searching for a version of this situation where he still had control, but it was gone, replaced by something quieter and far more certain. And Marcus's father took one more step forward, not closing the distance completely, but making it clear that distance no longer meant safety. His voice still even, still controlled, but now carrying a final layer of clarity. "There is a difference," he said, pausing just long enough for them to listen, "between a mistake and a decision." And no one interrupted, because the distinction was already settling into them, reshaping how they saw the last 10 minutes, how they understood their own actions. And one of the men tried again, his voice lower now, almost careful. "We did not mean for it to go this way." And the sentence lingered for a moment before Marcus responded, his tone steady, almost reflective. "Meaning is what you tell yourself after the fact," he said. "Choice is what defines you in the moment." And that line landed deeper than anything before it, because it did not accuse, it revealed. And across the street the woman recording whispered again, her voice steadier now. They cannot talk their way out of this. And she was right, because this was no longer a conversation. It was a realization unfolding in real time, and Marcus could see it in their faces, the shift from defense to recognition, from reaction to understanding, and it brought back another memory, not sharp this time, but distant, a younger version of himself standing beside his father as he watched someone try to explain away a decision they had made. And his father had told him then that people do not fear consequences, they fear clarity, because clarity removes every excuse they were planning to use. And now that clarity was here, standing in front of them, undeniable, unshaken, and the man who had been the loudest earlier finally spoke again. But this time there was no edge in his voice, no attempt to control the tone, just a quiet admission that he did not know what came next. "So what are you going to do?" he asked, and Marcus did not answer right away. Because the answer did not belong to urgency or emotion, it belonged to inevitability, and his father responded instead, his voice calm, measured, and final. "What happens next was already set the moment you decided who he was," he said, and the weight of that sentence settled over them like something permanent, something that could not be undone or reinterpreted. And in the distance, another presence became noticeable, subtle but clear, as if the world beyond this street had already been informed, already begun to respond. And Marcus took a slow breath, not out of tension but out of completion, because the moment he had been standing in from the beginning had finally reached its turning point. And he looked at the man in front of him one last time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm certainty that carried more weight than either, and said quietly, "You were never in control of this." And for the first time since it all began, no one disagreed. The silence did not lift, it settled deeper, like the moment had finally reached the point where nothing else needed to be proven, only understood, and Marcus stood there with the same stillness that had carried him from the beginning. But now it was different. Now it was no longer being questioned, it was being recognized, and the men in front of him felt it in the way their posture had changed, the way their voices no longer tried to rise, the way their eyes moved less and less because there was nowhere left to look for control, and Marcus's father did not rush to fill the space. He let it sit, let it press, because pressure reveals more than words ever could. And when he finally spoke, it was not louder, not sharper, it was quieter, but somehow more final. "You thought this was a moment you could walk away from," he said, his tone even, measured, like he was stating something already concluded. "But moments like this do not end when you leave, they follow you." And that sentence landed in a way none of them could ignore, because it shifted the timeline. It made this no longer about what had happened, but about what would continue. And one of the men swallowed hard, his voice low, uncertain. "We can fix this," he said, the words coming out slower than before, like he was testing them as he spoke. And Marcus tilted his head slightly, not dismissing, not reacting, just observing. "Fixing something means you understand it," he replied calmly. "You are still trying to explain it." And the difference settled between them, clear and unmovable. And across the street the woman recording whispered again, her voice steadier now, almost analytical. "They are realizing it too late." And she was right, because realization had already arrived, and it did not come with noise. It came with silence, the kind that removes every option except acceptance. And Marcus felt the memory return once more, not sharp, not distant, but complete, standing years ago beside his father, watching another moment just like this unfold in a different place, with different faces but the same pattern. And he remembered asking then why his father never raised his voice, why he never reacted the way people expected, and his father had told him that power is not about being heard, it is about being understood, and understanding does not need volume, it needs clarity. And now that clarity was here, standing in front of them, undeniable. And the man who had been speaking earlier looked at Marcus again, not with challenge, not with defiance, but with something closer to recognition, like he was finally seeing the situation without the filter he had started with. "We did not see it that way," he admitted, and Marcus did not respond immediately, because the statement was no longer something to argue. It was something to acknowledge, and his father answered instead, his voice calm, unwavering. "That is exactly why it matters," he said. And the words did not carry anger. They carried truth, the kind that does not need to be reinforced. And in the distance, the quiet presence that had been building became more defined, not loud, not intrusive, but undeniable, as if the world beyond this street had already begun to respond to what had happened here. And Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, because the moment had moved beyond confrontation. It had entered consequence. And he looked at them one more time, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to mark the end of what they thought this was, and the beginning of what it had always been. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same calm certainty that had defined him from the start. "You did not just act," he said quietly. "You revealed yourselves." And this time, no one tried to answer, because there was nothing left to say that could change what had already been made clear. The moment did not move forward in a rush. It unfolded, slow and deliberate, like something that had already been decided long before anyone here realized it. And Marcus stood at the center of it with the same quiet control, his presence no longer questioned but fully acknowledged, and the men in front of him felt it now in a way they could not ignore, not because of what was being said, but because of what was no longer being said, the absence of excuses, the absence of control, the absence of anything that could shift the direction this was heading. And Marcus's father let the silence stretch just a little longer before he reached into his coat. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the next phase had begun. And when he pulled out his phone, the motion itself carried weight, not because of the object, but because of what it represented, and he dialed a number without looking down, his eyes never leaving the group in front of him. And when the call connected, his voice remained calm, precise. "It is done," he said. "Nothing more. Nothing less." And that was enough, because whatever existed beyond this street had already been set into motion, and the men heard it in the tone, in the lack of explanation, in the certainty that did not need to be justified. And one of them shifted again, this time more noticeably, his voice tight, uncertain. "Who did you just call?" And Marcus did not answer, because the answer was already arriving, not in words, but in the subtle changes around them, the distant hum of engines, the quiet alignment of vehicles that had not been there before, the sense that this moment was no longer contained to what they could see. And across the street the woman recording whispered again, her voice steady now, almost certain, "It is bigger than this." And she was right, because the scale of the situation had expanded without anyone announcing it. And Marcus's father lowered the phone slowly, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time since he arrived, he addressed the question directly. "I called the people who handle what comes next," he said, and the simplicity of that sentence made it land even harder, because it removed any illusion that this could be resolved here, in this space, with these people. And Marcus felt the shift settle completely now, the transition from moment to consequence, from interaction to outcome, and it brought back the final piece of memory he had been holding on to. His father telling him that real power does not argue, it organizes, it moves quietly, it arrives fully formed, and now he was watching it happen in real time. The structure building around a decision that had already been made, and one of the men tried to speak again, but the words did not come out the same. They hesitated, broke, and reshaped themselves mid-sentence. "We did not think," he started, but Marcus cut in gently, not interrupting, not raising his voice, just finishing the truth. "That it would matter," he said, and the correction settled into the space with finality, and no one argued, because they understood now, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to know that the moment had moved beyond their reach, and in the distance, the presence that had been building became more defined, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, as if the world beyond this street had already begun to respond in ways they could not control or predict. And Marcus looked at them one more time, his expression calm, his voice steady, carrying the same quiet authority that had defined him from the beginning. "This is where it changes," he said, and the words did not sound like a warning. They sounded like a fact, and for the first time since it all began, the men in front of him did not try to respond, because they finally understood that whatever came next was no longer something they could influence, only something they would have to face. The shift was no longer subtle, it was structured, and everyone in the street could feel it even if they could not name it. The way the atmosphere had tightened into something controlled, something deliberate, something that no longer responded to voices but to decisions already made, and Marcus stood at the center of it with the same calm presence, except now it was no longer just composure. It was authority revealed, and the men in front of him felt it in the way their words had slowed to a stop, in the way their posture no longer held shape, in the way their eyes searched for something that was no longer available to them. And Marcus's father did not move quickly. He did not rush the moment, because this was not about escalation. It was about completion, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried that same steady precision that had defined every word before it. "You asked what happens next," he said, not raising his tone, not emphasizing the sentence, simply placing it into the space like a fact waiting to be acknowledged. And one of the men nodded slightly, not out of agreement, but out of recognition that the question had already been asked and could not be taken back. And Marcus's father continued, "Now you begin to understand the scale of what you chose." And the word scale settled into them differently, because it suggested something larger than consequence, something wider than the moment they had been standing in. And as if responding to that exact idea, the quiet presence in the distance became visible, not suddenly, not dramatically, but clearly, additional vehicles positioning themselves along the edge of the street, not blocking, not surrounding, just present in a way that made their purpose unmistakable, and no one announced them. No one needed to, because their arrival spoke for itself. And across the street the woman recording lowered her voice even further, her words almost reverent now. "They are not here to argue," she said softly. "They are here to act." And Marcus heard it, not because he was listening for her, but because the truth of it matched exactly what he already knew. And the men in front of him shifted again, their attention pulling outward now, trying to track everything at once. The vehicles, the presence, the quiet coordination that had replaced the chaos they started with. And one of them finally spoke, his voice tight, uncertain. "This is not necessary," he said, but the sentence sounded misplaced, like it belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. And Marcus responded without hesitation, his tone calm, almost reflective. "It became necessary the moment you decided it was not serious." And the correction landed with finality, removing any remaining distance between their actions and what was unfolding now. And Marcus's father took one final step forward, not closing the gap completely, but enough to anchor the moment where it needed to be. And when he spoke again, his voice did not change, but its meaning did, because this time it was not explaining. It was concluding. "You are not dealing with a situation," he said, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You are facing the outcome of your own judgment." And the words did not echo, they settled, and no one interrupted, because interruption no longer had a place here. And Marcus felt the moment fully aligned now. Every piece exactly where it needed to be, the silence, the presence, the understanding that had replaced assumption. And he looked at the men one last time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the same calm certainty that had carried him from the beginning, and said quietly, "This was never about what you did." He paused just long enough for them to listen. "It was about why you thought you could do it." And that was the line that shifted everything completely, because it removed the focus from action and placed it on belief. And belief is what cannot be undone with apology or explanation. And for the first time since the moment began, the men in front of him stood without resistance, without argument, without anything left to offer, because they understood now, not just what had happened, but what it revealed. And in the distance, the quiet structure that had been building reached its final form, ready, waiting, inevitable. And Marcus's father turned his head slightly, not away from them, but toward what was coming next. And in that small movement, the message was clear. This moment was over, and what followed would not be decided here. The moment did not explode. It settled into something heavier, something complete, like the final piece of a structure locking into place. And Marcus could feel it in the way the air no longer shifted unpredictably. It held steady, controlled, as if every variable had already been accounted for. And the men standing across from him felt it too, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow, undeniable weight pressing down on everything they thought they understood just minutes ago. And Marcus's father did not rush to speak, because there was no urgency left in this moment, only clarity. And clarity does not need speed, it needs space. And so he let the silence stretch just long enough for them to sit inside it, to feel the absence of control, the absence of options, the absence of anything that could reverse what had already been set in motion. And when he finally moved, it was minimal, a slight turn of his head toward the presence that had been building along the edges of the street. And that small gesture was enough, because it signaled transition, not escalation, not confrontation, but transition from moment to outcome, and the vehicles that had arrived earlier now felt different, no longer just present, but active in a way that did not require explanation. And one of the men noticed it first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the quiet coordination. "What is this?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost cautious, as if speaking too loudly might make something worse. And Marcus did not answer, because the answer was already unfolding in front of them. And his father responded instead, his tone unchanged, steady, final. "This is what accountability looks like when it does not wait." And the sentence landed without force but with absolute certainty, and no one interrupted, because interruption no longer had a place here. And across the street the woman recording lowered her phone slightly, not because she wanted to stop, but because she understood that what she was witnessing was no longer just an event, it was a turning point, something that would not need replay to be remembered. And she whispered softly, "They are not in control anymore." And Marcus heard it, not as confirmation, but as recognition, because that shift had already happened long before it was spoken aloud. And one of the men took a step back, not dramatic, not sudden, just enough to show what his voice no longer could. And he tried once more, his tone careful, measured. "We can explain," he said, but the words did not carry the same intent. They sounded like something offered too late, something that no longer matched the scale of what had been revealed. And Marcus looked at him for a moment, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a calm understanding that carried more weight than either. "Explanation comes before the decision," he said quietly, "not after it." And the distinction settled into the space with finality, removing any remaining illusion that this could be reframed or reduced. And Marcus's father took one final step forward, not to close distance, but to anchor the conclusion where it belonged. And when he spoke again, his voice did not change, but its meaning did, because this was no longer about understanding, it was about consequence. "You thought this would end here," he said, his gaze steady, unwavering. "But it does not." And the words did not echo, they settled, permanent. And Marcus felt the moment reach its full weight, every piece aligned, every assumption replaced by clarity, every voice replaced by silence. And he took a slow breath, not out of tension but out of completion, because the moment that had begun with noise had ended with truth, and truth does not argue, it remains. And as the presence around them continued to solidify, quiet, controlled, inevitable, Marcus looked at the men one last time, his expression unchanged, his voice steady, and said, "This is where you stop talking and start understanding." And for the first time since it all began, no one tried to respond, because they finally realized that whatever came next was not something they could speak their way out of, it was something they would have to face. Nothing rushed forward and nothing pulled back. The moment held exactly where it was meant to be, suspended between what had already happened and what could no longer be avoided. And Marcus stood there with the same quiet certainty that had carried him from the beginning, except now there was no tension left in it, only resolution, and the men across from him felt that shift more than they saw it. The way their own presence had diminished without anyone telling them to step back, the way their voices had disappeared without being silenced. And Marcus's father did not move immediately because he did not need to. The outcome had already taken shape around them, structured, deliberate, irreversible. And when he finally spoke again, his voice did not change, but its weight did. Because this was no longer about understanding, it was about closure. "You thought this would fade," he said calmly, his gaze steady, "that it would end the moment you walked away." And the words landed not as accusation but as correction, because they exposed the assumption that had carried them into this moment in the first place. And one of the men shifted again, his shoulders lowering, his posture no longer holding any form of resistance. "We did not think," he started, but the sentence never finished, because even he could hear how incomplete it sounded, how irrelevant it had become. And Marcus watched him for a moment before responding, his tone even, almost reflective. "That is the part you keep coming back to," he said. "What you did not think, what you did not see, what you did not expect." And he paused just long enough for the pattern to settle into them. "But none of that changes what you chose." And the distinction remained in the air, steady and unshaken. And across the street, the woman recording lowered her phone slightly, not because she wanted to stop, but because she understood that this was no longer unfolding for the camera. It was unfolding for itself, and she whispered softly, "This is the end of it." But Marcus knew it was not the end. It was the turning point, the place where everything that followed would carry the weight of what had just been revealed. And his father stepped forward one final time, not to close distance, but to mark the conclusion of the moment itself. And when he spoke again, his voice was as calm as it had always been, but now it carried something final, something that did not invite response. "You are not being judged by what happened here tonight," he said, his eyes steady on them. "You are being judged by what you showed when you thought it did not matter." And the words did not rise. They settled, permanent, and no one tried to answer because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to reshape, only the understanding that had replaced every assumption they had started with. And Marcus felt the moment complete itself, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to repeat itself because it has already done its work. And he looked at them one last time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the same calm presence that had defined him from the beginning, and said quietly, "This does not follow you because of what you did." He paused just enough for them to listen. "It follows you because of what it revealed." And that was the line that sealed everything, because it removed any remaining illusion that this could be left behind, that it could be explained away or forgotten. And in the distance, the quiet structure that had formed around them held steady, not moving in, not moving out, simply present, waiting. And Marcus's father turned slightly, not away from them, but toward what was already prepared beyond this moment. And in that small movement, the message was clear. This part was over, and whatever came next would not need to be explained. It would simply arrive, just as precisely as everything else had, inevitable and complete. The moment did not end with a sound. It settled into something quieter, something permanent, like the final note of a song that does not need to be repeated because everyone already feels it. And Marcus stood there with the same calm presence that had carried him from the beginning. Except now there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reveal, only the truth of what had already unfolded. And the men across from him felt it fully now, not as confusion, not as resistance, but as understanding, the kind that does not arrive all at once but stays once it does. And Marcus's father turned slightly, not away from them, but toward the structure that had formed around the moment. And that single movement marked the transition, not from tension to release, but from exposure to consequence. And no one followed, no one stepped forward, because they understood now that this part of the moment was no longer theirs. And Marcus took one slow step forward, not to confront, not to dominate, but to stand where the truth had already placed him, his voice steady, clear, and final. "You kept asking what happens next," he said, his eyes meeting theirs one last time. "This is it." And the words did not rise. They did not need to, because the meaning behind them carried everything they required. And one of the men lowered his head slightly, not in defeat but in recognition, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled where it belonged. And another looked toward the street, then back at Marcus, as if trying to measure something that no longer needed measuring. And across the street, the woman who had been recording lowered her phone completely now, not because the moment had lost its value, but because it had reached something beyond documentation, something that did not need to be captured to be understood. And she whispered softly, "It is done." And Marcus heard it, not as a conclusion, but as confirmation, because what had happened here was not about the moment itself. It was about what it revealed, what it exposed, what it made impossible to ignore. And his father paused beside him for just a second, long enough for the silence to settle one final time. And then he spoke, his voice calm, unwavering, carrying the same quiet authority that had defined everything before it. "You did not lose control tonight," he said, his gaze steady. "You showed what you believed when you thought it would not matter." And that was the line that closed everything, not with force, not with confrontation, but with clarity, the kind that does not fade, the kind that follows. And Marcus felt the moment complete itself fully now, Every piece exactly where it needed to be, every assumption replaced by truth, every word replaced by understanding, and he turned slightly, not away from them, but toward what was already moving beyond this moment. Because what came next did not need to be announced. It would arrive on its own, just as everything else had, precise and inevitable. And as he walked forward, the space behind him remained still, not frozen, but changed permanently. And the men who had once filled it with certainty now stood in silence, not because they were told to, but because they finally understood that silence was all that remained. And Marcus did not look back, because he did not need to. The moment had already done what it was meant to do. And as the quiet structure surrounding the street began to move with purpose, controlled and exact, one final truth settled into the air, unseen but undeniable. This was never about a single moment. It was about what that moment revealed, and once revealed, it could never be undone.